This time is a complicated time. Growing up, many of us were taught some of these myths and legends about the famed first Thanksgiving. Whether it be around tables, big feasts, and potlucks, even in schools, these stories surround our nation's mythos. Even in my case, growing up in the 90s, we had several different school projects around Thanksgiving, all of which pointed to this mythic meeting place of indigenous peoples and colonists. We would make paper pilgrim hats with glued-on yellow buckles or create these feathered headbands in imitation of sacred ceremonial indigenous headwear. Now, some of this was before we had a raised consciousness and awareness around cultural appropriation and these sensitivities. Though this points out just how deeply enshrined this mythology is, especially in our culture so rooted and informed by white supremacy culture, a culture that presumes whiteness as the predominant and superior way of looking at the world, our histories, and our stories. Right at this tension point of this culture is where this complicated and messy relationship between gratitude and grief exists. On the one hand, giving thanks in this time involves reconnecting with loved ones, of being at tables laden with good food and conversation. And on the other hand, this is, as our reading names for us, a day and time of mourning. It is a grieving of the violence and atrocities committed against indigenous peoples by European colonists, of explorers capturing indigenous peoples and selling them into slavery. It's a grieving of the genocidal attack on indigenous heritage and culture, with the ways in which these narratives centered in whiteness have erased the fuller picture of what really happened. It's a memorial for the slaughtering of millions and millions of indigenous people and the theft of their lands by outsiders. And while it's a day of mourning, it is also a day of celebration, celebrating the ways that indigenous peoples have survived and endured so much of this cultural and systemic violence, and how they are still here today. Yes, in the name of all that is complicated, this is a challenging time for us to make sense of. These conflicting messages between gratitude and grief cause a sort of dissonance and discordance. How can we hold both gratitude and grief together? How do we hold these when gratitude might seem to overshadow or even distance us from these feelings of grief and mourning? Is it really okay for us to gather to give thanks for this season, for the abundance in our lives when so much ongoing violence persists against indigenous peoples in our country? Last year marked the 400th year following the landing of the Mayflower at Plymouth, Massachusetts. And in this 401st year, it is all the more important for us to examine what really happened in our history. It's important to break through some of these myths and hold the harder parts of our history we might wish to gloss over, or that we simply find uncomfortable or awkward to talk about. In the reading that Susan shared, we hear about the Wampanoag who lived across New England in present-day Massachusetts. Wampanoag leader Frank James's speech spoke to the harsh realities of the first real Thanksgiving, not this mythological meeting place of friends around a table, but, in his words, a capture of Indians, taking them to Europe to sell them as slaves, and robbing the graves of my ancestors, and stealing their corn and beans. James names it well in saying the following: "It is with mixed emotions that I stand here to share my thoughts. This is a time of celebration for many, the anniversary of the beginning of the white man in America. But it is with a heavy heart that I look back upon what happened to my people." For James and for Indigenous peoples, holding this history as it truly happened feels heavy. James's sharing of this history in what would be known as the first National Day of Mourning in 1970 was quite discordant for those in attendance to hear. It sounded out of tune with the legends and myths that so many had grown up around in society with and in wider society. It conflicted with this tension and a desire to keep everything happy and friendly, to avoid conflict rather than embrace it. For James and others who honor this heavy history, there can be no gathering around a table with a blind sense of gratitude for what white supremacy culture teaches us to be grateful for. Instead, there is a heavier gratitude found in the truth of history. There's a gratitude in honoring the millions of Indigenous lives that have been lost in these centuries of violence. Gratitude, in this case, becomes a turning toward these harder truths rather than away from them. Thanksgiving becomes giving thanks for what and who we have not lost in this entire colonial project. In unpacking and discussing this hard history, this is not to shame or make you change your plans for gathering this week. Indeed, gathering with family and friends around tables of abundance is a fixture of this season. In its own right, it's also a lovely tradition to share in, to hold gratefulness at the center and to share what you have more than enough in your own life of with others. Though this gathering around tables must also include these harder parts. We must be able to face up to the history of what really happened on Thanksgiving and how this story has been manipulated and changed into these false peace narratives and myths. Gratitude, in this case, must not be a cause for silence. It must be a call for resilience and resistance, as well as holding these truths that are harder to swallow. It must involve a willingness to listen to dissonance and discordance rather than running away from it. From my time studying music theory, I find that music offers us an interesting way to look at this theme of discordant thanks. For those of you who are musicians or know a little bit about the science behind music and sound, you'll know that the pitches in a chord of music have a unique relationship to each other. For example, in what we'd call a chord on a major scale, there are 3 different pitches or notes that ring and sound out together in a pattern of a triad. The 3 notes are each in a fixed position on the scale with a particular distance from each of them. And if you look at the ways that these sounds move through the airs in sound waves, these waves form and intersect in these beautiful patterns, the small waveforms fitting neatly within the larger ones. Visually, we can see resonance of these waves, these notes, and how they produce a bright, colorful, happy sound when they are played together. Listening to this sound, we recognize it almost immediately as a major chord, a sound that we've been brought up through generations of musical developments and innovation and knowledge to appreciate. Although what's more fascinating to understand about music and the relationships between these notes is that, in reality, they are almost never actually in perfect relationship to each other. I know that this feels like you may have been lied to for your entire life. For example, there's a difference between what we call just tuning or intonation, or the tuning that the notes and these waveforms have with being scientifically exact to what they are, and what we call equal temperament, a fancier way of saying more equal tuning. In fact, if you are a pianist or have ever tried to tune a piano yourself, you know just how near impossible it is to tune, especially trying to get all of those 88 keys and notes to sound exactly right, to be exact to the scientific measurements of their tuning. Interestingly, when you play chords on a perfectly tuned piano, the chords themselves sound dissonant. They just don't work together. The neat little waveforms conflict with each other and produce something. Lord knows what it is, but it's definitely not a major chord that you or I recognize. Tuning a piano requires some of this active dissonance. It requires the person tuning it to purposefully detune it in order for it to be more in tune. Doesn't that sound like it really shouldn't make sense? I remember I was confused and even flabbergasted when I learned about this as a violinist, where tuning gets even more confusing and complicated, trust me. But to save this from being a Music Theory 101 lecture any further, the message behind this and what we can learn from music is that we don't get resonance and consonance without also dissonance. To bring this back to Thanksgiving and this conversation around gratitude and grief, we cannot have the happy, vibrant feelings of this season without also being willing to entertain some dissonance. When we gather around the tables this coming week, we must also be able to detune some parts of the conversation. We must be able to hear some of the dissonance and sorrow in order to hear more of the resonance of gratitude. This is a freeing message. It gives us permission to not need to reinforce these perfect, peaceful narratives about the first Thanksgiving that never actually happened. It gives us permission to mention the harder parts of this season for Indigenous peoples, narratives we so often try to brush under the Thanksgiving table because they're discordant with the predominant narrative, discordant with what we were taught or brought up to believe in society. We must be willing to hold this dissonance between what white supremacy culture teaches us about Thanksgiving and gratitude and what our indigenous friends and neighbors have known and experienced for generations. So where do we go from here? What is the way forward in holding this discordance and dissonance, especially when it sometimes feels really hard to make a space for this? We can start by divorcing our Thanksgiving celebrations from the actual Thanksgiving mythology itself. We can leave behind the narratives of pilgrims and Indians and the first friendly meal, and instead opt to make a space for recognizing the harm. At your meal, you might have an honest discussion about this history and share more about why this matters. You might set a place at the table for those who aren't there, in honor of the real and true stories and accounts that were originally omitted from the tables of history. You might light a candle for Indigenous peoples everywhere, naming this as a celebration of both gratitude and grief, all held at the same table. There are ways that we can purposefully work against the overarching narrative surrounding Thanksgiving and lifting up the stories and histories of the marginalized and vulnerable in our society. Giving thanks in this time of year is by its nature discordant. So why turn away from this? Why not tune into it instead? In Betsy's Time for All Ages this morning, we hear a story from Indigenous peoples in our own area, the Anishinaabeg, who are also the Odawa in Ojibwe. In the language of Anishinaabe-Moan, the language of this people, we can see the indigenous ways of knowing and hear it in our own language. We hear a profound sense of gratitude for the earth and its sacred abundance that we all share in. We witness the power in how the Anishinaabeg and their language and culture have endured, despite the ways in which these have been threatened. This Thanksgiving and in Thanksgivings across the country, we might make a space for this discordant gratitude and thanks. We cannot know true gratitude and thanks without also holding the fuller picture. And it is through knowing grief that we also know celebration. To close, may you gather this week with those who matter most to you in this spirit of discordance. May you be willing to face the harder truths beyond the myths of Thanksgiving that we are steeped in across our society. May you feel comfort in this discomfort, knowing that the project of dismantling white supremacy culture must continue on in us. May our gratitude be a source of resistance. May our gathering bring with it streams of resilience and renewal. Be blessed this week. I wish you all peace in this season. May it be so, and amen.